First of all, I would like to ask Professor Stark, who has not spoken today yet, concerning a very difficult but also important topic. Professor Stark gave a brilliant talk in this very room 1.5 years ago concerning the theological and philosophical foundations of the heresies of Cardinal Caspar. And now what in moral theology is prevalent, namely Hegelianism, Gnosticism, also applies in a sense to liturgy. Is the modern Mass product of a legitimate evolution or not? From our discussion, which we already had today, we must conclude, well, it is not a legitimate evolution, it is not a legitimate development. There are other, more sinister ideologies underlying the new Mass. And as Professor Stark is an expert on this topic, his talk was published and reached many people. It was translated in several languages. I would like to ask him to give us a brief introduction into the idea of Gnosticism, of Hegelianism, and the way in which it applies to the modern liturgical and liturgiological discussion.
Thank you. I want to use a simple approach. First of all, we have to see that the development of the liturgy happens or takes place in the context of theology. So what we have in the background are certain ways how Catholic teaching changed, not Catholic teaching understood as the magisterium, but Catholic teaching that is brought to the public in the universities. And I want to start with something that happened just a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, the new Superior General of the Jesuit Order was asked about our Lord's words on matrimony and on the dissolubility of marriage. And what he said was very interesting. First of all, he said, well, you know, Jesus used a certain language, he lived in the context of a certain culture, he had a certain public that he tried to reach with his words, but all these things have changed and always change. Language changes, the cultural context changes, the people are changing, so we have to reinterpret the words of our Lord in these different contexts that are changing over the years and over the centuries. And he said, which is really very interesting, he said, well, and by the way, we didn't have tape recorders really to know what Christ actually said, but what we have in the scriptures is the interpretation of the authors of the scriptures and how they understood the words of our Lord. That means we don't have no real ground on which we can stand in our theological interpretation or our theological thought. Things always change. We don't know what our Lord really said. It all depends on several changing contexts. But this is only the first layer of the problem that I want to speak about to you. This is the layer of, I would say, modern mentality. It is the modern mentality which is illustrated by this song, by the title of this song by Bob Dylan, "The Times They Are A-Changing." This is what modern man thinks about culture, about even his religion. But this is, as I said, only the top layer. There is a layer beneath that, and this is what I could call, the first layer is the layer of mentality, the second layer is the layer of ideology. What is the ideological layer that lies under this layer of mentality? This ideological layer is the layer of evolutionism. And evolution takes place in, and this is how modern man thinks. Evolution takes place both in nature and in culture. And evolution means that we have a development from simple to complicated, from primitive to sophisticated. History, as well in nature as in society, is an uprising development which makes things better and better. This is what man thinks about history. It is an evolution, and there are very interesting discussions in America for several years where very, very important scientists begin to doubt the biological evolution with very good arguments. I'm not very much in this discussion, but some friends of mine in the United States are. So we can see that not even in the biological sphere, this ideology of evolution is really sufficient, or it looks like, if things are changing there in natural science. But underneath the layer of mentality and the layer of ideology, there is even one more deeper layer, and this is the layer of metaphysics. And the layer of metaphysics on which all these other things, that means the evolutionary ideology and the mentality that springs from it, this deepest layer on which all this is grounded is a certain metaphysics, and it is the metaphysics of Gnosticism, which says in its core that not only the world is developing and on an uprising course, but that the absolute, which is the foundation of all reality, in itself develops, and the way it develops is that it floats into its own creation. And it develops the absolute, that means the divine cause of everything, develops itself in this evolution which takes place in nature and in culture. And we have this Gnostic metaphysics started or was constructed at the same time when the Catholic Church started to lay down its theological foundations by means of Greek philosophy since about the second century. And as theological thought in the Catholic Church developed, at the same time this very alternative to Christianity, that is Gnosticism, also developed. And when you look into the history of thought, you can see that each and every heretical movement in the church history, from the ancient times through the Middle Ages until today, all these movements have always been based on this Gnostic metaphysics. And the church managed to hold down the influence of this Gnostic metaphysics until the end of the Middle Ages. And from the 15th century on, the whole thing exploded and began to poison our whole culture. The European history from the 15th century on until nowadays is a constant rise of Gnosticism and of Gnostic ideas, which were most sophisticatedly put down by Hegel, who developed the most sophisticated system and the most elaborated system of Gnostic thought, which goes back to the ancient times and developed from that time on. And the problem is that in the 19th century, where the Catholic Church came under pressure of the liberal world, which led to all these struggles combined or connected to the name of Pius IX and the Syllabus of Errors and all the following popes who fought against modernism, which is liberalism within the church came under pressure, and some Catholic intellectuals thought that the way to deal with that problem might be to adapt Catholic thought and Catholic teaching to some new metaphysic ideas that were invented in the beginning of the 19th century, and especially connected with German idealism, and there especially with Schelling and Hegel. And they tried to base Catholic teaching on the metaphysical ground of German idealism, especially of Schelling and Hegel, and they built a school, the so-called Tübinger Schule, which was very influential in the theological sphere in Germany, and to which people like Caspar belong, which they are very proud of. I think this evolutionary thought based in Gnosticism at its end provides the context of the development of a theology in which context the interpretation of the liturgy and the praxis of the liturgy developed in the way that we have seen in the last decades.
Okay, thank you. So the underlying idea is the same with Darwin, isn't it? If a fish changes very often, it becomes a man. And if an engineer develops a vacuum cleaner very elaborately, after many, many missing links, a razor will emerge, or a laundry machine, or whatever. But the question is, now I would like to ask our very esteemed guest, Professor Kwasniewski, is there a legitimate development within liturgy?
Yes, I was thinking, Professor Stark, as you were speaking, about a very important distinction that Vincent of Lorraine makes. Vincent of Lorraine was an early church father who wrote a work called the Commonitorium, which was essentially a very lengthy warning against heresies arising from people who departed from tradition. That's his fundamental thesis. Whenever you depart from tradition, from what's been handed down, then you will end up in heresy. And he makes the distinction between growth and change. He says an organism grows when it adds to itself without changing itself. So as we grow up from children to adults, we remain the same person, we have the same name, the same dignity, the same DNA, right? All sorts of fundamental things about us remain the same, even though we develop in accidental ways, important but accidental ways. And he contrasts growth with mutatio. Mutatio for him is when one thing mutates into another and becomes a different essence. And he says for religion, for the Catholic religion to do that's what heresy is. It's a mutation rather than a growth. So I think in the realm of the liturgy, and there's absolutely no question that liturgy develops, not only in the Western sphere with all the diverse rites, the Mozarabic rite, the Ambrosian rite, the Roman rite, the Gallican rite, the mixture of Gallican and Roman, and so on, but also in the Eastern sphere. I mean, as fixed as the Eastern liturgies are, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom took centuries to develop. The liturgy of St. Basil developed, and so on and so forth. And yet, these are additions being made to something that already exists, to a pre-existing kernel, and the kernel is devoutly respected, is revered, is jealously guarded, handed on with great love from one generation to the next. And because of the love and devotion of the people, they want to add more to the liturgy. They want to add, so to speak, bells and whistles, right? They want to add more incense or more processions or preparatory prayers or subsequent prayers, the last gospel, right?
Repetitions.
Yeah, repetitions, right? So there's a kind of augmentation and elaboration of the liturgy. But you never have, in East or West, you never have people coming to the liturgy and saying, okay, look, this liturgy is wrong. There's something wrong with this liturgy. We need to take it apart, divide it among 30 different committees called cetus, and we assign the lectionary to this cetus, and we assign the preparation part to this cetus, and the Eucharistic canon to this part, and we work for a few years very busily, and then we come together and we glue it together, and we say, this is our new rite. That's never happened. That's inconceivable for Christians to do such a thing. And so in that sense, it seems to be clear, it's not a growth, but a mutatio. That's
now, thank you. I would like to give the word to you, because you're the only one here on the panel who lives a religious life with a very strict structure. So you want to add to Professor Kwasniewski, but I also would like to ask you, what is the experience of a monk of the same liturgy every day? Is it boring? Is it dull? Has it to be changed? So maybe you could give us an inside glimpse of liturgy and of its development.
Well, I would begin with what seems like a counterexample to what you've said, namely with the liturgical reforms that were done in my own order, in the Cistercian order, at the time of its founding. The Cistercians were founded with the ambition of returning to the original observance of the rule of Saint Benedict. And so they wanted to remove the additions to the monastic rule that had been made by Cluny, by the monks of Cluny, already going back even to Benedict of Agnane. The monks of Cluny had added many prayers to the monastic liturgy, so that at Cluny the liturgical prayer was almost perpetual. The monks would go into the cloister for 5 minutes for a break, and then they would come back into the choir and keep on singing. Everything was absorbed into the liturgy when they made the baking of the hosts for Mass, for example, was done. The grinding of the wheat was done vested in albs and cinctures, and they sang the penitential psalms, and then they mixed the wheat with other psalms and put them in the oven and so on. Everything was a liturgy. And the Cistercians said, this is not what the rule of St. Benedict says. And we returned to the primitive observance. They abolished many, many additions that had been added by Cluny and returned to the liturgical office as it had been laid down by St. Benedict, which divides the life of the monk between liturgical prayer and lectio and work. In Cluny, the monks didn't do any work. They had serfs who worked, and the monks just spent the whole day praying. Seems like heaven on earth, but the Cistercians said no, and they were very austere. They allowed only a very little bit of gold, for example, in the liturgy. The chalices were silver, and only the inside that touched the precious blood was allowed to be gold. And the ornamentation of the churches was very austere as well. You had only a crucifix and an image of Our Lady, and otherwise no statues or pictures in the church. And the candlesticks were to be made of bronze, not of gold or of silver. So you have there what seems like a counterexample, where they want to return to the original gestalt, the original form of the monastic liturgy, precisely by taking off additions. And maybe you could have a comment on that before I then answer your question.
Sure. No, it's fascinating. I think it's true. So in the history of liturgy, you definitely have moments of expansion and moments of contraction. It seems to me, though, that the example that you're speaking of, if I could use a metaphor, it's a little bit like saying we don't want to have a 7-course meal, we want to have a 3-course meal. So let's cut away some of the courses that are there. We don't attack them, we don't try to change them, but we just say we only want 3 courses. But there's a different kind of change that would be like going from a cooked meal to fast food, or going from Austrian food to Chinese food, or something like that. And that's something that you never see it would be very strange if Roman Catholics decided one day, let's do Byzantine prayers. Let's start to celebrate the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Beautiful liturgy, but it's not our right, So I think that's the more radical kind of change. I think what you're talking about is well within the sphere of among the liturgical offices developed, to choose which ones fit most with your monastic life seems to me a different kind of...
Yes, and this is the question which I would really like to ask you. Is there a need for change, for example, in Heiligenkreuz? I was maybe a bit harsh concerning the orders and the liturgy of the order, but Heiligenkreuz is an exception, as we all know. I mean, this is the reality. So, but what is your experience? Do you feel a need for change, or is it okay the way it goes?
I don't feel a need for change. Obviously I feel a need for change in the sense that I need to be ever more conformed to the liturgy that we sing. We do not sing the office as it was laid down in the Holy Rule. So St. Benedict says that after he gives the order of the divine office, which psalms are to be sung at which hours, he then says that a monastery can change this order as long as they continue to sing the whole Psalter in 1 week, all 150 Psalms in 1 week. After the council, in Heiligenkreuz there were some changes, not as many as in most monasteries, but we too made changes, and one change was that we went from the monastic Psalter, from the traditional monastic office to a 2-week Psalter. So now we sing the Psalter in 2 weeks, in a 2-week cycle, and but even in the 2-week Psalter, I think the kind of effect that this repetition of the divine praises day for day has is still there. At least maybe certainly it would be in many ways preferable if we had not changed to a 2-week Psalter. But even the 2-week Psalter still has this character where you sing the same words every 2 weeks. Many of the psalms are repeated every day, in fact. For example, at Compline, every day the same 3 psalms. Right? Every day we sing the same 3 psalms at Compline. And there's no spontaneity, there's no reacting to the situation in the moment. Every day at Compline, you sing the same 3 psalms. And the monastic fathers compare the monks to farm animals in their stalls, ruminating, chewing their food over and over again, their fodder. And the monks are chewing on the word of God over and over again, and there's an inexhaustible wealth there. And St. Benedict says the monks should so sing that their hearts should conform to their voices, their spirit should conform to their voices. Mens nostra concordet voci noster. So there's, and that is a process that should take a whole lifetime. There's always a greater wealth there in those words that you've sung so many times. Before the reform in Heiligenkreuz, as in almost all monasteries, the custom was to pray Compline in darkness, because everyone knew it by heart.
I have a thought if I could add to that. I heard an Armenian priest recently talking about his experience with the liturgy. Their liturgy is very stable and very uniform. They have very few things that change about it. And he said that a woman, he works in Germany, so a woman once approached him and said, "Father, don't you ever get tired of celebrating the same liturgy over and over again?" And he said to her, "Would you get tired of seeing your mother every day, or of seeing your wife, or seeing your husband every day? You know, the same person every day." And if the answer is yes, then there's something wrong, right? So, getting back to the point about Gnosticism, that metaphysic of flux, it's Heraclitean in a way, Heraclitean flux. Mm-hmm. The Catholic understanding of reality, it seems to me, is much more fundamentally rooted in the concept of immutability, unchangeableness, than in the concept of change. Obviously, change is real, but God is unchanging, he is immutable, and human nature is also unchanging, right? What man is always the same, from Adam to the very last man who will ever live on this earth. And therefore, all things being equal, the liturgy ought to be more unchanging than changing, right? In order to correspond to who God is and who man is.
It's interesting that you mentioned Heraclitus, because to my opinion, the alternative between Heraclitus and Parmenides is the big struggle in Greek philosophy, and they both got it wrong. Mm-hmm. Because to my opinion, in Heraclitus we have Hegel in core, and in Parmenides we have Spinoza. Mm-hmm. These are very similar constructions. And who got it right was Plato, because he invented a possibility to think change within stability, or stability within change. The problem with the concept of tradition and identity within many theologians, and I get aware of that when I get into deeper and deeper into the works of Walter Kasper, which I've studied a lot for the last 1.5 years or 2 years, they have a concept of identity or a concept of tradition, which is very much influenced by this concept which is represented by Heraclitus, because in Heraclitus' philosophy, nothing has an identity, with one exception: the structures in which the flux continues, which is led by the logos. And this is why Heraclitus, as well as Parmenides, are heathens, because they think that there is nothing outside of the cosmos, but that the divine and cosmos are identical. In one conception, it is just one as a number in Parmenides, and in the other conception, which is more sophisticated, you have the only thing that really is stable and has identity is the logos. Everything else changes, but the logos in itself needs this change to exist and to exist. And now we have a situation under the influence of Gnosticism, which very many people are not aware of, that they are influenced by it. But this influence of Gnosticism led to a concept of tradition and of identity, which I think I can identify in, for example, Walter Kasper, where we have a concept of tradition where nothing in tradition stays stable without tradition itself, you know? It's only the development to be connected with something earlier. This is what tradition is all about. But within this development, everything can change. There's nothing identical, and that matches very well with postmodern thought, where, for example, postmodernists deny that there is something like a personal identity with reference to Freud and other sociologists. So we live in a postmodern age where we believe that identity is something that just doesn't exist.
Yes.
And the problem is that we have this old heresy of Gnosticism, which has influenced our theology, and this theology matches very well in postmodern mentality, and this makes this whole mixture so explosive and so dangerous.
I would like to say one more thing about the difference between Reform and Revolution, looking at monastic history. There's a very amusing passage in A History of the Cistercian Order by an American Cistercian from the Abbey of Dallas. It's a chapter on the second order of the Cistercians, as it were, the sisters. And he says that if you look at the history of the Cistercian nuns, from the Sisters of St. Bernard of Clairvaux to the present day, you see periodically their reforms. And the reforms always have one main point. The main point is always to restore the strictness of the enclosure, always. Throughout the whole history of the order. Whenever there was a reform, the reform was, you see this very nicely in Mère Angelique of Port Royal. She slams the door in the face of her parents. It's re-establishing the enclosure. And he says, except for the Aggiornamento after Vatican II, where the reform was exactly the opposite, to open up the enclosure.
Yes, this is a good occasion maybe to go into a second topic of our discussion. Professor Kwasniewski is a great fan of Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson and his work, whom I also very much appreciate. And one of these works, a historic novel from the time of the English Reformation, is called By What Authority? This question is not answered to in this book, but the title is very good. By what authority? Namely, by what authority did King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth change the religion of England? By which authority did Cranmer and Cromwell and all these guys persecute the church? So my question to Professor Kwasniewski is, by what authority did Paul VI introduce a new missal? I'm aware of the fact that no one of us is a canon lawyer, but despite this, we must ask ourselves who gave the authority to make such a big transition, and was the missal of Paul VI promulgated in a juridical correct way? The question is urgent because Benedict XVI said in Summorum Pontificum that the old rite has never been abrogated. But every person living in the 70s experienced that it was abrogated. So what is your opinion on this topic?
Yeah, it's a very difficult set of questions that you've asked. There are actually several questions there. The first, most basic point I could make is that the office of the Pope seems to have changed. The understanding of the office of the Pope seems to have changed under certain modern pressures, and I'm not sure exactly where to put my finger, but Cardinal Newman talks about the office of the Pope, the papacy, as a remora, a barrier against change. And Newman, when he does his historical overview of the function of the papacy, he says, in almost every case in church history, the Pope is the one who says, no, we will not change. Right? This new idea, this new practice, we don't know it, we've never seen it here, we're suspicious of it, or we reject it. And in fact, the Roman liturgy was one of the simplest liturgies of all the liturgies, Eastern and Western, because elsewhere, apart from Rome, the liturgies developed, they grew in various ways. In Rome, the conservative spirit was so strong that they didn't change. If you have a pope who's driving innovation or novelty, there's something wrong with that picture. That's an overstepping of the office of the papacy, an exaggeration of it, and something that the Eastern Orthodox can and should object to. They have a right to object to that. That's an office that is too big for itself. You know, it's not. When you get to the specifically liturgical question, here I have to agree with Monsignor Klaus Gamber that the rite that Pope Paul VI promulgated in 1969 cannot be called the Roman Rite. He calls it the modern rite, or the modern papal rite. And he says that from the point of view of a liturgical scholar, scholar of liturgical history, it's impossible to see this as the Roman Rite. It can be seen as loosely based on the Roman Rite, but it's far more different from the preceding Roman Rite than the Roman Rite was from many other uses and rites that existed in the West. There's a much bigger gap there. So the question then becomes, I think, can a pope promulgate a new liturgical rite, even if it's not the Roman Rite? You know, could he invent a rite and say this is valid? And it seems to me that you can't simply deny that he has the power to institute such a rite. The question is, does he have the moral authority to do so? Ought he to do so? Not can he do so, but should he do so? And there, I mean, my personal opinion is no, he does not have the moral authority to do that, and it's a kind of abuse of papal power to do so. And therefore, I'm not surprised at how many evil consequences have come from it, because I think that you can judge a tree by its fruits.
It was Martin Mosebach who said it is an act of tyranny. Because tyranny in the ancient times was consisted of changing ancient rules,
Yes.
or
Laws.
Laws. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was imposed on the church without the church really desiring a new rite. So is the promulgation of the new missal deficient, juridically speaking?
I don't know if this much is clear. When you look into the details, the promulgation of the new missal was done in a confused or clumsy way. The language, when I've read several canonical studies of it, and the language is not as clear as Pope Pius V's language was when it came to the Tridentine Missal of 1570 with Quo Primum. There, the language was very carefully crafted. It was exceptionally it was clear. With the Constitution Missale Romanum, it was not clear whether there was an abrogation intended, or an obrogation, or a derogation. It was unclear. And then when the official version of the text was published in the Acta Apostolicae Sede, sentences were added to it that weren't in the original version because they were trying to clarify, and yet even those clarifying sentences are obscure. I have difficulties with them.
Who did that? The Concilium, or?
I don't know. I mean, it's just that when the official text, the text of Missale Romanum was published first, and then a few months later it appeared in Acta Apostolicae Sede.
And there were differences.
With a new paragraph added at the end because people had asked questions. And even the new paragraph is not entirely clear. So I think when you look into it canonically, you can see why Benedict XVI was able to say that the old Roman rite, the usus antiquior, had never been abrogated, because in fact it hadn't been, canonically speaking. But to make things even more complicated, I heard a canon lawyer explain that there's a distinction between the use of a liturgical book. Let me put it this way. The legitimacy of a liturgical book itself, and then the right of a priest to use that book. That these are obviously intimately connected. You can, but they're not exactly the same. So you could have a legitimate liturgical book, but a priest who doesn't have the permission to use that book. And if you make this distinction, then I think it can be said, this at least seems to me the clearest explanation, that the Missal of Pope Pius V, as emended subsequently by various popes down to 1962, that was never abrogated, but it seems that Paul VI intended to take away the permission of priests to use that missal.
That's the point.
And if that's indeed what he intended, then he would have the authority. Again, the question is, should he have? But he would have the authority to say, no, you're not allowed to use this book. You have to use this other book. Right? And that's why it seems that Summorum Pontificum, Pope Benedict said not only the old missal is not abrogated, but also the priests have permission to use this book without any permission from anybody. But he had to say both of those things.
Yeah. I don't want to give any answer to that question. maybe because of a defect in me, because it would be inconvenient for me if I celebrate the both forms of the Roman Rite. More often the new form, and about once a week the old form. And growing up as a child and as a youth and so on, I went usually to the ordinary form. And I think it's certainly, whatever ends up being the position you take on whether it was legitimately promulgated, this form of the Roman Rite, we know that God uses everything for the good of the elect, so that even things that were begun in confusion and trespass of power can be used for the good. And that's certainly been my experience, that even from the liturgy celebrated with the new missal, I've gained much spiritual fruit, and I hope that I've been able to give that spiritual fruit to others through celebrating with the new missal. So I think you can say, it would be possible to say both. You could say both, this was an abuse of papal power, but also God is able to use it to good.
Mm-hmm. It does seem, though, as if it would be important ultimately for a rectification to take place. That is to say, I think what Benedict XVI clearly envisioned, although how it will happen is much more difficult to say, he clearly envisioned a final outcome where the opposition of the two forms, or the abyss between the two forms, would be closed somehow. And he never really explained exactly how that would happen. He gave some very generic suggestions about mutual enrichment. But nevertheless, it is irregular for the Roman Rite to have two forms. It's a strange phenomenon. It's never happened in the 2,000-year history of the Church. We've always had one Roman Rite, many other Western rites and Eastern rites, but there's been one Roman Rite, the papal rite, and now we have two forms of it. So it's objectively, it's an odd and strange situation, and therefore it does need a healing, right? Even though I grant what you're saying.
I would like to ask Professor Kwasniewski, concerning the solutions and concerning the required habits of the lay people, because as we see, very many lay Catholics are interested in liturgical questions and feel very uneasy about many developments which happened in the last 50 years. Professor Kwasniewski wrote a very interesting paper called A Defense of Liturgy as Carolingian Court Ritual. I found this very, very interesting and also hilarious in a way, because you say, well, very good that it is a Carolingian court ritual. So what is the problem with it? Maybe you could develop on some points how lay people should react to the liturgical catastrophe. Should we boycott the Novus Ordo altogether? Should we go to, as I do, to the Ukrainian Greek Catholics or the Armenian Mekhitarist if we don't get any Latin Mass in the old rite? So what are our objectives to do? How do you deal with the situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard. It's a very hard situation because let's just say some people have an easier time than others finding a reverent liturgy that spiritually nourishes them, through which they can give honor and glory to God. I have many friends who are fortunate to live in a place where the Fraternity of St. Peter or the Institute of Christ the King has a chapel, an apostolate, and they go regularly, sometimes even daily. I think that's ideal. If I would say, if a Catholic can attend the old liturgy, then he ought to do so. And otherwise he's depriving himself of so much of his heritage, his tradition, the spiritual riches that are there. So I mean, for me, if I can go to an usus antiquior mass, I always do, and that's not even a question. If I can't find it, then the second question would be: is there an Eastern Rite liturgy available? Because the Eastern rites have not been corrupted, they have not suffered the damage, and they're also equally rich repositories of the Christian tradition. I think that would be a good second choice, although it's not perfect because it's not your own right. Mm-hmm. You should really, if you can, you should worship in your own right. And then a lot of people have the situation of, well, they don't have either of these options available except unless they drive for a really long distance. And so then it's just a question of you have to go to the most reverent mass you can find, to fulfill your mass obligation. And then apart from that, I always say to people, don't forget that that the liturgy is not just the Mass. The liturgy is also the divine office, the breviary, the liturgy of the hours. And I encourage, I've done this in my own life, and I encourage other people, get to know Compline, get to know Vespers, especially in their traditional Roman forms, because those can be very nourishing, either individual, it's not strictly individual, but you can do it by yourself, or you can do it with your family. In my family, we pray Vespers together from the monastic breviary, the monastic diurnal. And my whole family loves to do Vespers. Right? We come home every day, we come before dinner, we do Vespers, even when there isn't Mass available. So I think those would be options. I will say this much, I'm very proud of, I'm impressed with a lot of my fellow countrymen in the United States. I know a lot of people who will drive an hour on a Sunday to get to a Mass in the old form, because it's so important for their family spirituality to do that and to be connected in that way with the liturgy.
It is the question how to bring the second generation into heaven also. Mm-hmm. As you're a father of two,
yes.
How can lay people nowadays who are married, who have children, act so that their own children don't get lost, if we may say so?
Yeah, what I've seen with my children and the children of other families is that they very quickly see the difference between a liturgy that is focused on God and on giving glory to God, thanking Him, praising Him, being sorry for one's sins, and adoring his presence and so on, and a liturgy that is community-centered or is distracting, has lots of different purposes. All the sorts of problems. We don't need to rehearse them here. Children very quickly see the difference between these two things, and it's actually I think it's confusing and harmful to them to go back and forth between these two worlds. It's Ratzinger talks about this. Well, anyway, I just think it's a problem to. You need to pick the way that is going to inculcate the right spirit, the right virtues, the right mentality, the right dispositions towards the divine, and those things are sadly lacking in many communities.
You are also an expert. We did not mention this for lack of time, but you are also an expert on Gregorian chant, and you also teach Gregorian chant at Wyoming Catholic College. Maybe you could give us a brief sketch about what the Gregorian chant is all about and how it relates to liturgy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I know some experts in Gregorian chant, but I love chant and I sing it, I teach it to people. I think Gregorian chant is more important than people realize because it's not just an ornamentation of the liturgy. It's not just a decoration, like the ornaments you put on a Christmas tree. They could be this or that or whatever. But the Gregorian chant is the music that grew up with the Roman liturgy. As the Roman Rite developed over time, the chant, the music of the liturgy, developed at the same time, and so it's the flesh of the liturgy over the bones of the liturgy. Or it's like the clothing of the Roman Rite. However you want to think about this. It's intimately a part of the Roman Rite. It is the Roman Rite in music. That's what chant is. So when you sing the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus down, you say, when you sing the introit, the gradual, the tract, the offertorium, the communio, you're singing the liturgy. These are not just like motets or hymns or whatever. It's the liturgy itself. So I would make the claim, maybe this will seem too audacious, too bold for you, but I would make the claim that Gregorian chant is as much a part of the Roman liturgy as the Roman canon itself is. Right? How do you know you have the Roman Rite? Because you have the Roman canon. That's the simplest answer to that question. If you don't have the Roman canon, you have something else. You don't have the Roman Rite. So the Roman Rite. But if you're going to sing the Mass as one should, because that's the most solemn, most noble form, as even Vatican II says, then it needs to be the music of the Roman Rite, which is the Gregorian chant, as Vatican II said, right? So that's where I think it's bone of its bone, flesh of its flesh, right? It's so intimately connected, and that's why sometimes you see traditional communities, they use the usus antiquior, they love it, but they have lots of vernacular music or lots of organ music, and the chant is not really present or not present very much. This is a problem. This is a problem in a traditional community because they're not realizing that by doing that, they've got a kind of Protestantized mishmash. They don't have the authentic thing.
You're making an interesting point because to talk about me personally, I love, for example, the masses written by Mozart, for example, or Schubert. But I love the music, but I have some experiences with the Eastern Rite too. For several years, I lived in a place where there was no Latin Mass that was convenient for me, so I went to a Byzantine Mass, and I got used to this approach that they have to liturgy. And after that, I understood that Pius IX somewhere said or wrote that opera music doesn't have to take place in the liturgy. And I thought, exactly, that's the point. No Byzantine or Eastern rites, no Christian who is used to the Eastern Rite could understand that we use the music of Mozart, for example, in the liturgy, because they have a music which is just liturgical music, right. And we have a music which is just liturgical music, and we should stay to that. So we should hear to the Mozart masses in a concert hall, but we should use the Gregorian chant for liturgy. I'm convinced of that. Meantime, and what do you think about early polyphony?
Okay, so this is great. I thought that it would be heresy for me to say anything about Mozart and Schubert in Vienna. I love their music too. Absolutely love it. I've sung Mozart masses. I've sung Schubert masses. The thing is that the church, Joseph Ratzinger, in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, he talks about 3 moments of crisis in the history of church music. The first moment of crisis was at the Council of Trent. The second was in 1903, Pius X, Trilla Sollicitudini. And the third crisis is today, during and after the council. And he says what each of these crisis moments has in common is the eruption of the secular into the sacred, into the temple. So at the time of the Council of Trent, you had various secular songs or themes coming into church music.
Because they were so popular with the Protestants and they were successful.
Right, exactly. And then with Pius X, it was the influence of opera on sacred music, right? And then with our present situation, it's the influence of pop music and folk music or pseudo-folk music on the liturgy. But in all 3 cases, you have sacred music being redesigned, recast in the form of secular music. So that when somebody hears it, they tap their toe, they think, oh, this is great, I'm being entertained, and they've stopped worshiping God. That's the problem of having secular music come into the temple of God. So Pius X enunciated a rule, very perfect rule. He says, the more that music is like the Gregorian chant, the more suited it is for the temple of God. And the less like it, the less suited. And then he also says music should not, even in its external features, sacred music, should not, even in its external features, remind us of secular music and secular things, right? So the worst case example of that would be to bring in an electric guitar and drums and so on, which only are associated with pop music, right? That's the only place. That's the desacralization of the liturgy. That's what happens. Now, obviously, Mozart and Schubert are great composers, so their music has much beauty to it. It's not the problem of pop music or something like that. But the problem is that their music is very metrical. It's very operatic in style. It's very complex. It's very entertaining, right? It's like concert music, and so it tends to detract from the kind of meditation, the purification, the focus, the prayerfulness, and the adoration that we need to give to God. I know when I hear a Mozart mass, I'm just entertained by it. This is what happens. Maybe other people have a different experience with that.
Okay, thank you very much. As we are drawing to a close now, I would like to thank the gentlemen on the panel, our esteemed Professor Kwasniewski, Father Edmund, and Professor Stark for their participation. I think it was a great discussion with many interesting topics. Thank you for all the input which you have given us.